our first speaker is Karen Vancluysen. Before becoming Secretary General of Police Network, Karen worked as Network's Research Director for 8 years. She has always been involved in urban mobility networking, innovation and policy activities, as well as wide range of European urban transport research projects. You can follow her on Twitter, like I do, and there I would make a quote that I like. The key is now making sure that this temporary change becomes permanent. A lot has changed during the pandemic, and the question is, will we stick to these changes? And I'm not talking about just the webinars, it's new cycling lanes and numerous other improvements. Karen, are you with us?
I am, I think. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. The stage or the screen is yours. We're looking forward to hear from you and see your screen. So please begin. And of course, I will ask participants to ask questions. I will read them at the end. I already have one, but I will give priority to the participants. Karen, it's good to see you. So the webinar is all yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Finally, a part I understand. I didn't understand much from the introduction, except for Mikromobilnost, which I assume is micromobility. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Karen Vancluysen indeed, and let me try to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, it's working. Thank you.
Okay, great. So let's get started then. I'll be talking about managing micromobility, and as we nicely called it in the report that we published at the end of last year, taking the long view on short trips. So who are we? The Polis Network is a European network of cities and regions working together on sustainable urban mobility and urban transport innovation. We do that through peer-to-peer exchange, learning from each other's successes, but also each other's stupidities, taking a lot of policy action also towards the European institutions, being the voice of cities and regions, but publishing papers on hot issues like micromobility as well, and engaging in a lot of research and innovation projects, European funded projects, as you know yourselves as well, and have maybe also been engaging in. We currently have over 80 members from all over Europe, and it goes from small towns up to very big regions or even provinces. And also the city of Leuven, which is not only my hometown, is also a very active Polis member, and they will be presenting later on, as you know. So when we talk about sustainable urban mobility, what do we really talk about? And even more concretely, what do we talk about when we talk about sustainable urban mobility policy? A lot of demands and expectations are put on today's urban mobility systems, and especially if we talk about them being sustainable, we want those systems to be multimodal, intermodal, clean, safe, flexible, affordable, connected, user-centric, and so on. So quite a long wish list, I would say, which is ambitious but also challenging for our cities. If we want to reach all these things, we really need our system, our cities to adopt a systems approach, which means a mix of different types of mobility measures, which ideally also tick several boxes at the same time. So bring multiple benefits in one go, because we're facing many challenges on the local level, whether it's air pollution, whether it's congestion, whether it's climate change, you know, all these things need to be addressed. Also, I have a pop-up on my screen here. Mark is requesting remote control of my screen. I don't know who Mark is, but I think I will decline the request. And at the heart of a sustainable urban mobility policy is, of course, modal shift away from the private car, which we want to discourage in city centers. And that means also having public transport and active travel as the backbone of such a system. At the same time, however, what we have seen over the last couple of years is that the lines between the public sector and the private sector are blurring. It's no longer longer just a preserve of the public sector to provide mobility services. Increasingly also commercial players are entering that field and are offering mobility services to the citizens. So that leads to a bit of an identity crisis on the side of the public authorities. And it begs the question, what should the role be of the local authority in the transport system of tomorrow? And when we look at what's been going on over the last couple of years, we've been talking a lot about disruptions. There have been many innovations in the urban transport field that have been coming our way all at the same time and all at a very fast pace. The question is now, how do we deal with this disruption? And it's really important to realize that you cannot just be reactive as a city. You really have to be proactive, and you have to be strategic. And why do I want to stress this? Well, actually, all these innovations come with big promises. It's like they're going to solve all the problems in the field of urban mobility. But if you do not regulate these innovations, and if you as a city do not set the rules of the game, they may very well have opposite effects compared to the benefits that they claim they will have. Just to give a few examples, automation. If you do not set the rules today in terms of driverless cars arriving in our cities in a couple of years' time, it might also lead to an increase in congestion and an increase in kilometers driven because people will be perceiving travel time differently. Electromobility. If you do not adopt a multimodal approach and just let the market replace dirty cars with clean cars, you will still have congestion in your city streets. Mobility as a service, you know, all services integrated into one nice app. If you just leave it to the private sector, maybe the most commercially interesting modes will be prioritized and pushed to the user in algorithms, which are not necessarily the most sustainable modes that you want to promote as a city. And the same applies also to the field that we are talking about today, Mikromobilnost. If you do not set the rules of the game, also there you will see negative externalities. And generally speaking, also FOMO, the fear of missing out, is never a good reason to decide to engage in innovations in a city. You first need to look at the challenges you face locally and then think about whether these innovations can help you come closer to a solution or can help you to address these different challenges. And it's no different for micromobility. So the bottom line is, as a starting point, if you want to innovate and if you want to innovate wisely, you have to regulate, which means anticipate what is coming your way, try to build an understanding of the possible impacts of an innovation, maximize opportunities, but also try to minimize these benefits or negative externalities, which also involves talking and cooperating with these private players and exploring new types of public-private partnerships and new business models. And unavoidably, you will need a combination of carrots and sticks, of incentives, but also disincentives to make this happen. Basically, what we need is public sector oversight, and what we need is cities to be in the driver's seat. Now, these were the disruptions we were talking about until the beginning of this year, let's say, but then the biggest disruption of all came our way, and that is COVID-19. And we didn't see that coming. And also there was no roadmap that we could turn to. There was no recipe for this disaster. And what we really need to avoid in the current situation is that we go from a situation of lockdown to gridlock, and that we see that the challenges that we were already struggling with before and that I mentioned earlier would get even worse due to this current health crisis. Just to name an example, if everybody leaves public transport and goes to the private car because they see it as the ultimate safety bubble in the current circumstances, then of course the transport problems would get even worse than they already were. At the same time, however, I would like to highlight that for every threat in this current crisis, there is also an opportunity. But again, in order to capitalize on those opportunities, and I'll come back to that later on, we will have to be proactive once more, and we will have to make sure that we really take the decisions into our own hands. Now, moving on to micromobility specifically, we see that it links into a number of key policy areas and public authority interventions which are relevant. Of course, it links into the whole area of active travel, including the safety and health dimensions of active travel, which are being promoted heavily as modes these days by cities. But it also links to urban space management and parking management. There is a link, or at least there are questions in relation to environment and modal shift as well. There's the data dimension of these mobility services, services. And then there's the ultimate goal of multimodality and intermodality that we are striving for in our cities. And I'll come back to each of these areas in my next slides. So looking at active travel, of course, we all know the multiple gains that we can get through promoting cycling and walking in our cities. They're the cleanest modes, they're healthy as well. So there's also other policy areas that benefit from that. They improve generally the quality of life in the urban environment. And now with the introduction of the e-bike over the last couple of years, we're also tremendously extending the potential range of cycling beyond the typical 5 kilometers that we always used to mention. Of course, if we want to further promote these modes, it's also important to collect further evidence on their actual benefits. And that can also help us to justify policy choices in our cities and justify why, for example, we invest in better street design for cyclists and pedestrians and in dedicated infrastructure. I've put a screenshot here where you see all these numbers, which is from the European funded project FLOW, which has tried to quantify the impacts of cycling and walking, and also has upgraded traditional transport models to put walking and cycling on an equal footing, at least in those models, because they were very car oriented in the past. So this can also help you as a public authority to predict the impact of certain interventions in favor of cycling and walking, and also show to those who are maybe against it that it is not going to negatively impact the city, on the contrary. Now, coming back to the issue of e-bikes and extending the range, if you accompany the boom of e-bikes with also dedicated infrastructure such as super cycle highways, then really you can also start to use e-bikes for longer commuting distances, for example. And we've seen, like in the city of Aarhus, which is also a medium-sized city, that the high-quality commuter cycling routes that they introduced really went hand in hand with a substantial increase of the number of cyclists using that route. And now the questions, of course, are, what about this new mode, the e-scooters? Do we see similar benefits like with cycling and walking or e-cycling, or should we look at it in a different way? There are a number of concerns with regard to health benefits, with regard to safety, with regard to parking, and I'll come back to those concerns in the next slide as well. But before I do that, let's first have a look and take a step back in terms of bike sharing. So one part of the micromobility story. When we look at the history of bikes sharing, we saw that it initially started with what we would call dumb bike schemes. So a number of shared bikes available, but no smart technology behind, no dedicated stations behind. That then gradually moved to the dumb docked schemes, where we had dedicated stations across the city where you could rent a shared bicycle, but still no smart technology being used. That was then the next generation, where we had the smart docked schemes, where we have bikes that can be recognized digitally as well as users, and where data is being collected. These three generations of bike sharing were still in the hands of the public sector. So they procured the services and they cooperated with a dedicated supplier who was managing the bike share scheme for them. But then came the smart dockless schemes, and they were not coming from the public sector, but from the private sector. So free-floating dockless bike share schemes operated by commercial players and supported by smartphone apps with no dedicated infrastructure in the streets. And when they arrived, that's also when we needed to step in from the side of the public sector and make sure that these services were going to be regulated. So that was the situation, and that's the history behind bike sharing. Then suddenly this new kit in town arrived. The e-scooters were deployed very fastly and also massively on our city streets. And we could see that they were also taken up quite quickly by the citizens, and that they are being backed up by massive venture capital investments. The question, however, is where does this new mode fit in our infrastructure? Our infrastructure is not adapted to it because it's something new. There are some people who are also worried about the safety of these vehicles. And the question is also, do they really fill a gap in terms of first and last miles, for example? That's what they claim to be addressing in the overall urban mobility ecosystem. And then there's this issue, as you can see on the picture, of street clutter. Are they polluting urban space? Now, let me say a bit more about each of these points. E-scooter safety. In his introduction, Aljaz already referred to a report that was recently published by the International Transport Forum of the OECD, and they looked into the safety of e-scooters in particular. Now, generally, we can say that a trip by a car or a motorcycle is much more likely to result, of course, in the death of a road user than a trip by a micro vehicle, assuming it's capped at 25 kilometers an hour. And if we look at the differences between e-scooters and bicycles, we see that in terms of road fatalities, there is no significant difference between the two. And also in terms of the risk of an emergency department visit, there is no substantial difference. The risk of hospitalization, though, seems to be slightly higher with e-scooters, but some further investigation is needed. This is only based on 2 studies. Generally, we can say that micromobility can improve traffic safety overall in the city if it helps to reduce the numbers of cars and motorcycle trips in a city. So if we have this positive modal shift away from the private car onto e-scooters and other sustainable modes. Also, we can expect that safety of e-scooters will further improve once the users are more familiar with it and it's no longer such a novel form, but also once the car drivers get used to these new vehicles in the street. And of course, the more governments start to regulate and put dedicated infrastructure in place, the better the situation will become. Coming back to the point of street clutter, and this is of course where these e-scooters have received the most media attention. There was this public outcry, like they were polluting our streets, they were in the way of everybody. And of course, to a certain extent, this is true. But let's not forget the biggest polluter of urban space in our cities. And that is not this tiny e-scooter, that is still the private car. And they also park where they're not allowed to park, or they generally just take up a lot of space in our cities. So I would recommend the active and light modes rather to join forces than to start fighting each other, and together ask for more dedicated infrastructure for light and active modes in our cities. And that brings me to the next point, and that is that the public authority more and more is evolving into an urban space manager. And urban space is a very scarce tool, is a very scarce thing, and it's also therefore a very powerful tool, because public authorities are in charge of urban space and can decide what to do with that space. And by taking space away from a certain mode and giving space to another mode, you decide which modes in the city you want to prioritize. Also, of course, making our cities more dense through land use planning can help with having shorter distances that need to be traveled. And also, we can put a price on space. If you pollute space to a larger extent, and if you are a polluting mode on top of it, then you will have to pay a price for that. And then, of course, space also links into parking management, and that is important if we want to reduce the negative externalities as well of e-scooters, and I'll come back to that later on too. Finally, we see that as more and more modes are entering our cities, we probably will have to start managing that space in a more dynamic way in the future. For example, the curbside might have different functions depending on the time of the day. In the morning, we could be talking about deliveries. Over lunch, we could be talking about putting food trucks on the curb so that people can get something to eat. And in the evening, it could be pick-up and drop-off zones, for example, for ride-hailing services. So this dynamic dimension facilitated by the digitalization is something that will become more important in the future as well. Now, let me come back to the space issue, the elephant in the room. So we saw during the lockdown, in particular in the health crisis, these massive wide car lanes which were empty versus the small bike lanes and pavements, if there were any bike lanes in the first place, which were quite full because people were trying to stay active during the lockdown. So that again made very clear how unfair space in our cities has been distributed for decades, really. In the background here on this slide, you see a picture of the city center of Milan, where all the streets that are in red cannot guarantee physical distancing for cyclists and pedestrians. So quite a lot of streets, as you can see. And as a result, what happened during this COVID-19 crisis is a massive respacing of our city streets in favor of cycling and walking. Here you see the residential zones that were introduced in Brussels, where there was a reduction of the speed limit and also where priority was given to cyclists and pedestrians. In Rome, we see here a massive extension of cycling routes and of the bike network, and we cannot blame the Romans of being passionate cyclists. So we're not talking about the typical cycling cities here that took these measures. It's also cities where cycling was not really part of the culture yet. Here we see in Barcelona how pavements have been widened. This is a bicycle street that was introduced in the city of Milan. Pop-up and emergency bike lanes have been introduced. So basically, the space on our streets has been reallocated during the COVID-19 crisis. And this also has led to a real boom in cycling. And the issue is now, how can we try to lock in the benefits of this crisis and make sure that these temporary measures become permanent over time. We see that in some cases the likelihood of that happening is higher when we are talking about cities that have a very good sustainable urban mobility plan in place, because what they did is actually fast-track measures that were planned to be implemented in the next couple of years and implement them now in a couple of months or even weeks. So they just accelerated the change that was already starting to happen before this crisis, the change of giving the streets back to the people and giving the streets to active travel more fairly than before. Now, when we talk about modal shift, the other aspect that we should not forget about when we talk about micromobility, we have to make sure that these new services, and not just micromobility, but actually all these other shared mobility services as well, that they do not compete with the priority modes in our cities, cycling and walking and public transport, but that rather they fill service gaps, and that can, for example, relate to specific target groups, specific areas in the city, or first and last mile solutions. And we have to make sure also that the modal shift that is happening is therefore not an undesired modal shift. Just a very concrete example, what you see here on the slide is a screenshot of Google Maps, where you ask for a walking route. And what Google Maps is trying to do is nudge you towards using an e-scooter, which is faster, but of course, it's also generating revenue. And this is a typical example of a modal shift that is not bringing any benefit to the public sector or to the city as a whole. We're not looking for pedestrians getting onto e-scooters. We're looking for car users getting onto e-scooters. So we have to keep an eye on the actual impact of these new modes on the ecosystem and on modal shift in particular. And that needs better data and better evidence of what is actually happening. If we look at a couple of surveys that were carried out in cities, we see that indeed currently that modal shift is not yet going in the right direction, which doesn't mean that it's not going to happen in the future, but it will again require also an active intervention from the public sector. In Lyon, Marseille, and Paris in France, we saw, for example, that only 8% of the e-scooter trips were coming from former car trips, whereas the majority was coming from the sustainable modes that are the backbone of our system. And in Brussels, we saw similar results as well. So this is something we need to tackle, and for that we need better data, and we need sharing of data between the operators on the one hand and the cities on the other hand. And these services are very digital in nature, so the data is available. Of course, we need to prioritize which data as a public authority we need and which use cases are behind. But it is important when you are giving licenses or permits to these operators that you link a condition of data sharing to those licenses and permits. At the same time, and this is the result of a data survey that is currently ongoing from the side of police, we see also that the reality at the moment is quite challenging when it comes to the capacity and skills on the side of the public authorities to deal with that data versus the data intelligence on the side of the private sector. They are inherently digital in nature, whereas for public authorities, this is actually a new skill, and we can see from the results that in many cases the capacity internally or the new skill as such is still lacking. it will be important for cities to learn these new skills, but they can also outsource it. There are operators on the market, or integrators, brokers, which help cities to bring these data together into a dashboard and to help them interpret them for policy purposes. But so this is definitely a challenge that will be on the table for the next couple of years. I don't know what's happening here. Okay. Then coming back to what I mentioned with regard to intermodality and multimodality, if ever there is a momentum for sustainable modes to join forces, it is today. In the current health crisis, we see that public transport is suffering tremendously because people are afraid to use public transport right now, and also because public transport is facing reduced capacity due to the physical distancing requirements. So what we need is a better integration between public transport on the one hand and shared mobility on the other hand, to take some pressure away from public transport and spread the capacity and the travelers across the different sustainable modes. That's shared bikes, shared e-bikes, and shared e-scooters to begin with, if needed, car sharing as well. So what we also need is to adopt a broader definition of public transport, where we have a mix of mass transit on the one hand and shared mobility on the other hand. This will also require new types of public-private partnerships and new business models. And if we see that these services deliver a positive contribution to the urban mobility ecosystem, if they help you as cities to reach your policy goals, we should also consider subsidizing or partly subsidizing some of these services, because it will always still be cheaper to enter into a partnership with such an operator than to introduce or set up these services entirely yourself as a city as well. And we know that these services have been hit hard by the economic crisis that resulted from the health crisis too. And even before that, that they were living off venture capital and had not found yet a sustainable business model. So what we need is better integration, and that is a combination of physical and digital integration. Physical integration through stations and interchanges where different modes come together and are being offered. And not just stations, but also smaller hubs across the city where different services come together. And I'm sure Tim, in his presentation on the city of Leuven, will also come back to that. And then as the next level, we also need digital integration, bringing these different services together in a digital environment, such as mobility as a service, which will make it easier for users to switch between different sustainable modes and to combine them more easily, and to pay for them in one integrated environment as well. So hopefully that will help us to come to one big happy family, where public transport and shared mobility services work well together, and together form a sustainable front against this even higher threat today of people turning to the private car in a city environment. So that brings me to the need for regulation and governance, and how you can do that as a city. If you think back about the slide where we were talking about the different waves of bike sharing and the history of bike sharing, then we saw that the first wave of dockless, so privately driven bike sharing, was very, very disruptive. These new operators did not talk to the cities. They just arrived literally overnight. You were waking up in the morning to a city of colorful bikes, which maybe looked beautiful at first, but very often and very soon led to many problems, because there was no agreement with the city. There was maybe also competition with the traditional publicly managed bike sharing schemes. They were overcrowding urban space. They were parking wildly, and they were not even adapted to the European markets. Many of those bikes were Chinese, and they were too small, for example. And in some cases, we even saw that the apps were in Chinese. So in terms of communication with the user, that was also not beneficial for a European environment. So there were a lot of negative externalities, which really required the cities to step in and to regulate. And again, the aim is to maximize the potential of services like that, but also to minimize these negative side effects. We see a wide range of different models coming into the picture when it comes to regulation, which goes from the one extreme, which is a hands-off approach, where cities do nothing, which I do not recommend, up to a very other extreme, which is that you entirely ban operations of these private sector players, which in some cases makes sense, in other cases is not necessarily the best decision. So you have a range of other options in between, going from setting regulatory ground rules, issuing operational permits and licensing, or maybe start with pilots to see if it's something that works well, and on the basis of that deciding whether you continue or not. And it's important to point out that cities can regulate also, and that operators actually are not against regulation. The new generation of operators know that they have to talk to cities and engage in a dialogue also if they want to survive over the longer term. So they are not against regulation, and it can even help to create a level playing field for them and their competitors. And indeed, cities are regulating. Of course, the examples that I'm giving here are more for big cities, because that's where these new services arrived first and where they created problems as well. But that does not mean that these innovations or in the field of regulatory frameworks cannot be introduced in a smaller city as well. Brussels was one of the first to introduce a regulatory framework for micromobility and positioned itself as a welcoming city, because traditionally Brussels is a car-oriented city, even though over the last couple of years this has been changing, and we see a clear move also towards giving the streets back to the people and promoting other modes. That's why they positioned themselves as a welcoming city and see a clear role for micromobility in Brussels. But they have issued a licensing system, and they have set clear rules that the different stakeholders need to comply with. The same for Madrid, where they introduced a new sustainable mobility bylaw a couple of years ago, where they also include these new vehicle types such as e-scooters into the bylaw. They work with a system of licenses that they give to the operators, but they have also introduced themselves accompanying measures, such as, for example, 30 km/h streets in 85% of the urban city core. And they've also integrated these modes into a public sector-driven mass app. In the meantime, many of the operators that they had given a license to, which were a high number, around 15, have already pulled out again. It's still an uncertain and unpredictable market. So there will be an upgrade and an update of the bylaws soon, also to learn from the experiences of the past 2-3 years and adapt accordingly. And it's important to recognize that we are in a trial and error phase when it comes to regulation. And this is perfectly fine. It's new. Cities need to think about what works best and need to try out what works best and what doesn't work and adapt on the basis of that. So it's important also that our regulatory frameworks in the future become more agile and can factor in uncertainties and unpredictabilities, and that we can more easily adapt regulation whenever needed and not have to go through very lengthy processes. One way of doing that is also to have more light rules, such as the Memorandum of Understanding that was concluded by Lisbon between the city and the different operators, and where information was given and agreements were concluded in the field of parking, safety, environmental concerns, and so on, and where they also introduced designated parking zones, for example, in the city center. The iconic city when it comes to micromobility is, of course, the city of Paris. They have gone also through a whole process of trial and error when it comes to introducing legislation, starting with a charter of good conduct that had to be signed by all operators that were active in the city, by introducing at some point fees and fines as well for these vehicles, but also by taking on commitments from their side as well, by increasing the number of parking spaces for these vehicles, so that also at least that part of the story, that negative side effect of urban clutter, was tackled. At some point, they also, based on the data they collected, saw that there were too many operators in the city, and that's when they decided to launch a call for tenders and limit the number of licenses to 3 for the whole city, because they thought this would be sufficient to meet the needs of the population in terms of micromobility, both e-bikes and e-scooters. And that's what happened earlier this year, and now we still only have 3 operators left in the city of Paris: Lime, Dot, and Tier. So there was a very clear list of conditions that they had to comply with in the call for tender, and those that were considered to respond the best to those conditions were the winners that are now currently on the very interesting Paris market. And that brings me to the specific situation of small and medium-sized cities. And we have a lot of attention for those cities as well within the context of Polis, because we have an SMC platform, small, medium-sized cities platform. And the message we try to convey there is that you don't have to be big to be innovative. Absolutely not. But at the same time, when we look at the new mobility services in particular, we see, of course, that they first went to all the big cities because commercially that's the most interesting for them. And so it's sometimes even a challenge for smaller and medium-sized cities to attract these services to their localities. And at the same time, however, there might be interesting potential because smaller and medium-sized cities sometimes have a less extensive public transport offer compared to the big cities. It's more limited, so there is more room for new services to step in and to complete the sustainable mobility ecosystem. Also, we see that linked to smaller and medium-sized cities, there are very often suburban and rural areas even where the car dependence is still very, very high because there is no alternative. But how can we then create this critical mass to make it also interesting and attractive for these players to come to smaller and medium-sized cities? That's again where we need to look at new types of public-private partnerships, new business models and subsidies, where you engage in a cooperation with them to see how the critical mass can be reached, how you can deliver your policy objectives, and how they can still make money out of their service. And we have had some exploratory talks with our own smaller and medium-sized cities where they were looking, for example, into the potential of having a partnership between the operator taking care of the operations, the city partly subsidizing the trips, and even the region stepping in. And as a third, and that's very interesting, stakeholder in the game, big employers in that area, which are also benefiting from the fact that their companies become more accessible by alternative modes and not just by car. So there's a lot of exploration to do, but I think if you get the mix right, that it could be very interesting also for SMCs, as we call them, to engage in this conversation. And to come up with a concrete example of regulation from a small and medium-sized city, that's Bilbao in Spain. They have already a perfect model split if you look at it. I mean, many cities would definitely be jealous if they see this, with a 65% share of walking, 25% public transport, and 11% car use only. So what they decided is to entirely ban e-scooters. They don't see an interesting case in terms of modal shift for the e-scooter. Also, they have a very popular e-bike sharing scheme that they are operating, which is docked. They are operating in cooperation with Nextbike. And so they further want to push e-cycling first before they even think about a potential role for e-scooters. So sometimes, as an example, banning can also be the right decision. And Tim will definitely come back to that for the case of Leuven as well. If we have to summarize, and I'm almost at the end of my presentation, we see a number of emerging trends when it comes to regulation. Cities are moving towards a situation where they issue permits and licenses, no longer the traditional procurement approaches that we know from the past. They tend to put a limit, a cap on the number of operators, like we see happening in Paris. The focus is a lot on regulation that ensures orderly public space, which can be done by introducing designated parking zones and even no parking zones. And this can be easily enforced through the digital nature of these schemes. And that's through geofencing. It means that you go to a certain area where you're not allowed to park, and it will not be possible for you to end your trip in your app. So automatically you will have to take your e-scooter or e-bike somewhere else where it is allowed to park. So that's a way to put some order into the chaos. And also the micro hubs with dedicated parking zones try to keep the flexibility of free floating, but still have some more order into the parking chaos. Important issues are also equitable access, and what some cities are doing is introduce some kind of give and take. If the operators want to be present in the commercially interesting inner city cores, then the city asks in return that they also deploy part of their fleet in other areas where you have specific target groups which have limited means and they get reduced fees, or areas where there is a high level of car dependence and they would like to have alternatives in place. Data sharing for monitoring and enforcement, as I mentioned, becomes part of the conditions for these operators to get a permit or a license. And we see also slowly, when you look at cities where the data dimension is already working well, that they are also looking at the data in terms of the number of trips per vehicle per day. And on the basis of that, cities can decide whether an operator can extend the fleet or needs to reduce the fleet or needs to be removed altogether. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the challenge remains the business case and the pricing scheme that we need to get right. As a conclusion, I would say onwards and upwards, mobility service operators are engaging more and more in dialogue and cooperation with the cities, which is a positive evolution compared to the first generation. But it's still a very new and rapidly changing sector, which comes with a lot of uncertainties as well. So we'll have to see also what the market consolidation beyond the hype will be. Which modes will stay, which modes will go, which new modes might be arriving. Maybe in 1 year we'll all be on an electric skateboard, I don't know. And as I mentioned, trial and error is important and is allowed. It's okay to see that things don't work and to change your regulations accordingly. So if regulated well and integrated with your policy goals, I do think there is a potential positive role to play for these new services. That brings me to the end of my story, where cooperation is the key word, as in many cases. And I would recommend you have a closer look also at the paper that we published at the end of last year on micromobility, which is helping cities to navigate this new field. I also warmly invite you to the Polis annual conference, which is taking place at the end of November, beginning of December. Unfortunately, digital, like many other events this year. And of course, you're also very welcome to become a Polis member. As I said, from very small towns up to very big metropolitan regions, you're all welcome to the Polis family. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much. As you were mentioning, Polis, there's a question. How does the city become a member of Polis Network?
You find all the information on the Polis Network, polisnetwork.eu, and members pay an annual membership fee to the network, which is based on the number of inhabitants of a city. So the smaller you are, the cheaper it will be. And then you get full access to all the services. We have a wide range of working groups on all themes, and not just these fancy innovation teams, but also the very down-to-earth safety challenges, traffic management, social and economic access to the city. We cover everything that has to do with urban mobility and not just Mikromobilnost.
Okay, yeah, you got that word really well.
Yeah.
It is an international word, and Karen, thank you very much. This was very rich, and it also helped.
Welcome.
The connection is really good. It is almost as we are in the same office. Well, we're not sharing the office, but vision for better mobility or mikromobilnost, that's for sure. All these innovations come with big promises, you say, but it is on us to regulate them. Electric car is still a car, so not really a solution to the problem, although it is high on the agenda nowadays, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's really a matter of making sure that you provide the right context and framework conditions for these innovations. And of course, electric cars, it's better to have a clean car than a dirty car if you're still going to have a car, because they will never disappear entirely from our cities either. And they help solve the air pollution and CO2 problem. But then again, we need to prioritize fleets like public transport, which needs to be electrified as well. And then there's the e-bike, of course, which is still way cleaner than an e-car. So the multimodal perspective to electromobility is key.
I think you could stop sharing screen so we can see you. I have a couple of questions, and I also invite participants to ask them. You mentioned Bilbao and successful modality shares. even banned e-scooters. And I think I also read that Bilbao introduced a speed limit of 30
Yes.
kilometers per hour. Is that something we could consider doing? Do you think it could be implemented in other cities across Europe? That is a
Absolutely.
radical change for many.
Yes, absolutely. And we saw that some cities introduced it because of the health crisis. Let's hope it stays in place. But there are others where it was already on the agenda, like Brussels, you know, again, not one of the usual suspects. They have also introduced 30 kilometer per hour limits for the whole of the city. And this is a tremendous benefit in terms of safety gains. You know, if you reduce the speed, the risk of having severe injuries or fatalities goes down tremendously as well. So yes, absolutely, I would recommend it as a key measure for the coming years for many cities to introduce, especially as we want to further push and promote active travel as the key modes in an urban environment.
Well, I would like to ask the participants and just ask you, what do you think would the speed limit of 30 kilometers per hour work or function well in the city where you are? And just write it down in the chat section. There's a question from Maria. Did Bilbao ban only e-scooters sharing systems or also private use of e-scooters?
As far as I know, I don't think the private use is banned. That would be probably quite difficult as well. But they are not allowing any private players to come to the Bilbao market right now. And not even just e-scooters. They're also not allowing e-bike schemes which are run by the private sector. And there I have to say, and I told them as well, that I think they're not necessarily making the right decision, because their e-bike scheme, which is publicly procured and which is docked, is very, very popular, to the extent that they currently cannot keep up with the demand. And if you cannot keep up with the demand and you don't have the capacity at that stage to extend your service, it will lead to frustration with the users. And that's why I think an additional private sector player, which could help to, you know, meet the capacity or the demand that is there in terms of e-bikes, could help them to further promote cycling and e-cycling in the city, because it's a city with many different heights as well. So it also helps to have the e-dimension to the bikes in this context. And there was no big cycling tradition. So.
And the speed limit in Bilbao, is that a matter of also the pandemic of coronavirus? Has that have to do with the pandemic, or was that a
I'm not sure. It may have accelerated the decision, but I think it was something that they were planning to do as well. If I think about the general policies that are being introduced and have been introduced over the last couple of years, then I do think it was something that was in the pipeline anyway.
Yes, I see. And some regions are better prepared and some seize the opportunity, whether others don't. And you also say that trial and error is important. Can you name any practice that didn't bring expected results? And we all like to learn from mistakes of others.
Yeah. For micromobility in particular, the city of Madrid has realized in the meantime that giving so many licenses to like 15 operators and allocating them to dedicated neighborhoods was probably not the best decision. First of all, because from a user perspective and also from an operational perspective, it's very challenging to keep e-scooters in certain neighborhoods. And second, because the market is so unpredictable and agile, that many of these operators have pulled out. They should have checked more thoroughly which ones were more likely to be reliable and to stick around. Because of course, if you want these services to play a role and you start to count on them in terms of helping you reach your policy goals, you also have to make sure that you can count on them and that they're not going to disappear overnight, which is something that did happen during the pandemic, where especially the global players, the American companies, pulled out from one day to the next. And followed a purely commercial logic, whereas some European players actually saw a window of opportunity and started offering the services, whether it was e-bikes or e-scooters, for essential trips, for example, for people working in the health sector, or helping restaurants to do deliveries while they were closed and were still trying to meet customer demand and make some money. So that was very smart. In Brussels, the jump bikes, which were operated by Uber, they pulled out. And on the other hand, there was a local player called Billy Bike, and they stayed. They quadrupled the number of users for Billy Bike, and they reached the same revenue for 2019 in 2020 in April already. So for them, it has been a huge success, and it was very wise not to pull out.
I will now read the comments or questions from the participants. Gashper, without camera, asks everybody, or comments, if the streets are narrow enough, a single lane street, then one car going 30 kilometers per hour would prevent any other car on the same street from going faster without overtaking. That is the proposition here. Yes, and then Darko asks or comments, why the cities and countries in EU do not remove all subsidies from mobility modes and give the users a realistic view in the pricing of the particular mode of mobility. And the question, which type of mobility would prevail in this case by your knowledge?
Just leaving it to the decision of the user, I think, is difficult. We also always have to see what a user wants and what the city as a whole needs. And that's not necessarily aligned. In the end, we're quite selfish in the way we make our mobility choices. So we'll have to incentivize and disincentivize. And that sometimes requires political leadership. But what is really tremendously missing, and that's also linking into that comment, is the internalization of external costs. The real cost of owning a car is really not reflected in what people are paying for their cars today. And this is something that should change, and that will definitely help people to think about other modes and alternatives. It should become the obvious choice to go for a sustainable mode, if only for a pricing reason, but also from other perspectives. Like, it might be way faster to take a bike in a city than to try to navigate your car through all the ways that cities have tried to disencourage that car to be driving through the city. So yeah, that will help. It's a combination of it's a matter of nudging them in the right direction through sometimes severe penalties in the price range, but this still needs to happen.
Yes, and that reminds me to the great book title, The High Cost of Free Parking. It is a matter of cost as well, and we need to understand that cycle. There's a question from Alenka, very common to the Slovenian cultures, and the question regards, is related to Bilbao that we keep mentioning. If there's one thing we should take away from this, is also the 30 kilometers per hour speed limit. So Alenka asks, how are they able to supervise the speed limit? With high penalties?
I don't know what is currently happening in Bilbao in particular, but of course enforcement with any measure that you introduce will be important. Cameras play a role in that respect these days as well. But yeah, enforcement is key, and that applies to many of the measures that are being introduced. But also, of course, and that's a more long-term change that needs to happen, you need to adapt your infrastructure, though, so that if you have very wide lanes that encourage speeding, of course compliance will not be very high, because it just doesn't feel intuitive to lower your speed. But if the streets are narrower, as was mentioned earlier, or you build in barriers that prevent people from speeding, then that will definitely help and will make that speed limit more intuitive for the driver as well.
So, and David also adds that 30 kilometers per hour is currently the really important message within the European Union. It is a question of safety and also a shift towards micromobility or other, other ways of transport.
Maybe I can make a reference, just to conclude on the safety topic. We have launched the paradigm for safe city streets, which is also available on our website. And it's 10 principles that cities should adopt in order for their city streets to become safer. And one of the key messages also in that paradigm is sustainability and safety go hand in hand. If you make active modes safer, people will also use them more. So it sounds obvious, but very often safety and sustainability are still addressed in silos in cities, and the people dealing with safety, could be the police, for example, are not the ones working on sustainable urban mobility plans or measures, and those two worlds need to come together as one.
Before we go to a pause of this webinar, we have a poll questions that we'd like to ask to the participants, and it is, about whether their own regions will improve mobility during the pandemic. It's a challenge, and here's a yes and no questions. Will my region improve mobility during the crisis? I ask all of the participants to answer, and maybe Karen, you to comment on the results. It is an opportunity, but I'm afraid that many of the cities will not seize it. So let's wait for the results to come in. It's an important vote. We'd like to hear your opinion. Look around your own regions and cities. Do you think that mobility or infrastructure will improve? There are some short-term solutions that could become solutions to a larger problem. So do we see the results? Yeah, no. You see, it's like 81% say no. Do you think this is like, would you say that this is representative of European cities?
To a certain extent, yes, maybe, but I have to say that we really took stock within the Polis membership of what was happening during the pandemic in terms of interventions in the field of mobility. And we have seen a lot of good things happening. So at least on a temporary basis, I think a lot of good things have been done. And I think we should congratulate the cities for them. The key will now be, can they make it permanent? Will it be just a temporary thing, and will it then go back to the old normal or even worse? Or can we really capitalize on this opportunity? And that's the key issue where we again will have to be proactive. But there are two things that I also always mention also as a window of opportunity and trigger that could help to make these changes permanent. And that is, you know, the behavioral experts always tell us that that people are more open to changing deeply rooted habitual behavior if there is a life-changing moment. And usually then we talk about changing jobs or having babies or getting married or moving house. But I think COVID-19 could also be such a life-changing moment. There were people during the lockdown who suddenly started to cycle for the first time, and maybe they liked it and they want to continue this and make this part of their new behavior, just like we've all been forced to start working from home. And I'm sure there will be a lasting legacy from the teleworking dimension of this pandemic, which is also positive for mobility. And the second thing that can help is the fact that we are actually now in a huge street experiment. We have an enormous sandbox that we can play with, because people can trial measures in real life. And a good way to convince people of the usefulness of a measure is to let them experience how it is. What it is like to have cities where you have more cyclists and pedestrians, cleaner air, less congestion. And that will also help to win the hearts and the minds of the people and to make that change more permanently. Having said that, I choose to be optimistic, but there are cases like in Brussels where the Association of Motorists is now taking the city to court because of the pop-up cycling lanes, because they say, this is our lane. We have the right to drive there as a car user, and we shouldn't give it to the cyclists or pedestrians. Same, it happened in Berlin. So it will unavoidably be a fight for space. That's clear.
Yeah, definitely this topic needs a follow-up. Thank you, Karen Vancluysen, Secretary General of Polis Network.